Well, good afternoon and welcome to our first Carnegie Council lunchtime webinar. Like many of you, we're working remotely these days, so we're using this time to reach out to our senior fellows, friends, and constituents to talk about the important issues of ethics in public life. They're at the heart of the Council's work. So thank you all for joining us wherever you are. Our senior fellow, Nik Gvosdev, is in his office in Newport, Rhode Island. Just a brief intro of Nik. Nik is Professor of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport. And he is also Carnegie Council Senior Fellow in our U.S. Global Engagement Program. Just a word about the U.S. Global Engagement Program. It's animated by three goals. First, to reshape discussions of American foreign policy to address the causes and consequences of U.S. disengagement. Second, to move ethical considerations to the center of thinking about international relations. And third, to examine the narrative shifts taking place as America redefines its role in the world. Nik's talk today goes right to the heart of his work and to the engagement project itself. Great title, Fractured Globalization and Dissolving Ethics, which I think is perfect for this moment. So before turning it over to Nik, just a word about the format. Nik's going to talk for about 15 minutes. After that, he and I will chat for about 15 minutes. And the second half of the hour will be interactive, so we hope you'll join us with questions. You can use your chat function to pose your question, and Alex Woodson, our moderator, will read your question on your behalf. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Nik.
Thanks, Joel. Thank you all for joining in, and I'm looking forward to a fascinating discussion. You know, one of the things that when I tell people that I'm affiliated with the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, particularly when it's people, you know, that are at the Naval War College or that are part of the national security establishment, is the assessment starts out being that the strategic course of action and the ethical course of action are somehow in opposition to each other. That you can be ethical or you can be strategic, but that these streams don't easily cross. And yet what we're seeing with the pandemic crisis and what's happening in the international system is, in this case, a convergence of the strategic and of the ethical considerations, that they're actually coming together. And what I'd like to do in this opening part is not speak about the ethical question and the strategic question in the completely global framework of looking at, you know, humanity on a single planet, but bringing it to a more grounded and defined area, which is to look at how strategic and ethical considerations are overlapping and impacting the health and durability of what we usually refer to as the EuroAtlantic Community. So let me back up for a minute and just lay out the strategic picture. And that has been that for the last 70 years or so, it is an article of faith in the U.S. national security community that America's own security, prosperity, position in the world is enhanced if we can first promote integration and unity among our European allies so that they will work together, and then to promote a tie across the Atlantic between Europe and the United States, where Europe and America together can set a global agenda, that they can maximize their economic, political, military, cultural power to engage in other regions of the world, to spread zones of peace and security, to expand liberal democratic and free market institutions, and that for this to work, you need both a Europe which sees itself as integrated, and then to see Europe and America as forming this community, this EuroAtlantic community, where the countries and the populations believe that there is a tie that binds them, which is more than just simple cosmopolitanism, more than just simply saying we're all human beings, we all inhabit a single world, and therefore we have obligations to others as human beings. The idea of the EuroAtlantic community is that the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, Norway, Spain, Austria, Greece, should somehow feel that there is a greater degree of connectivity between them than they share with countries that are not part of the EuroAtlantic community. And generally, we measure membership in the EuroAtlantic community through its two core institutions, the first being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and then the European Union. Not all countries that are members of the EU are members of NATO. Britain, the United States, Canada are not members of the European Union, but are key members of NATO. And then beyond those two formal institutions, there's a whole dense network of ties that connect these countries together. Shared economic ties, technological ties, economic ties, so on and so forth. That's the strategic picture. Where the ethical piece comes in is both NATO and the EU are solidly grounded in the ethic of solidarity. That is, both of these institutions take as their starting point that the institution exists to promote solidarity among its members. The European Union does this through Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. NATO does this certainly most famously through Article 5, to a lesser extent through Article 4 and Article 3. The idea that when you're part of this institution, your problems are my problems. If something impacts you, it impacts me. If you are attacked or you are facing difficulty, I am obligated to render aid and assistance to you as if it was something that was impacting me. So the way you hold these organizations together has always been the promise of solidarity. The ethical component of it is your problems are my problems. Certainly during the Cold War, you had an existential threat, an existential military and ideological threat to the West, where it was easy to forge those bonds of solidarity. I teach history of the Cold War for Harvard Extension. Had a class last night. We were talking a bit about this question of solidarity. The idea that sooner or later in the 1950s or the 1960s, there was a sense that the Soviet Union wouldn't just simply stop at one or two countries. Ultimately, for it to achieve its objectives, it would have to take control of Europe as a whole and then be able to strike the United States. So that enabled countries and their populations to understand this sense of solidarity, that Germany's problem is Spain's problem, is Italy's problem, is Britain's problem, is Canada's problem, is the United States' problem. Similarly, the US got, and we sometimes forget that today, it was the United States which helped to get what is now the European Union started. And again, by promoting this idea of solidarity, that West Europeans faced with the threat of the Soviet Union could outclass any single European country by far, and the only way for Western Europe to consolidate itself would be to promote integration, and part of the way of promoting integration was promoting this sense of solidarity. And we've seen this all the way through to the current period. Why do taxpayers in Germany or Sweden contribute more? Why do other countries in Europe benefit more from EU stabilization and development funds? You might have a taxpayer in Sweden saying, why am I paying for roads in Portugal or Greece? But the sense that, well, you're paying for development there, and then in turn, they will be doing things for you. They will be buying your goods and services. They will be, as their economies grow, they will contribute, so on and so forth. So this ethical obligation of solidarity is written into these two organizations. And of course, it's been something that political leaders will always bandy about. We are together, we are united, so on and so forth. The pandemic response in 2020 has damaged that ethic of solidarity, because the pandemic, as it first arrived in Italy and Spain, as it began to spread to other European countries, as it then arrived in the United States, the idea that what affects you should affect me, and I should be giving you aid and assistance based upon this ethic of solidarity, based upon this strategic logic of solidarity, eroded very quickly. The initial response, as different countries within the EuroAtlantic sphere were impacted by coronavirus, was to put borders back up, was to institute export controls, was to say, you need equipment, but we may need it, and so we're not going to allow it to be exported to you. And what you've had, at least in those first critical weeks in February and in March, was countries within the Euro-Atlantic world not only simply not rendering aid. So the first ethic of solidarity should be, you're in trouble, I have something I can help you, so I will give you masks, ventilators, spare capacity, we will deploy people to help you. But you not only did not have the provision of aid, you had countries beginning to take steps which actively injured other members of the community, which is, we're not simply going to give you aid, but we will take steps in our own country which are going to actively cause the citizens of your country greater harm or greater tragedy. And when you have that, and it's a natural reaction, it's the countervailing ethic of sovereignty, which is that on the one hand, you have the ethic of solidarity, what affects you affects me, and then you have the ethic of sovereignty that says, the price of sovereignty, the price of self-determination is you take responsibility for yourself, for your own, and therefore you don't have a right to make claims on others, or those claims lessen against the claims of my own citizens. And so you saw with borders going up, checkpoints going up, restrictions, and then of course for the European Union in financial areas of countries harder hit by the pandemic, asking for the floating of what they were calling corona bonds, and more fiscally conservative countries in the Union being less likely to do it. We've had, of course, then across the Atlantic, competition for resources, competition to acquire patents and assets, and saying, well, if I acquire this asset or I acquire this company that's working on something, then they're going to do it for me and not for you. All of this creates damage to this ethic of solidarity. And this is why I'm concerned as we move forward that you already have people saying, well, this pandemic it's a problem and it's a crisis, but then it'll pass and somehow we're going to go back to the way things were pre-2020. My sense is that when you damage the ethic of solidarity, it's not that as if you can't reconcile, but you have opened up the possibility for countries and populations to say, the last time we had a problem, others did not have our backs, therefore we should be more concerned and reticent to so quickly offer aid in the future, or maybe that aid isn't dependable, so we shouldn't prepare or expect our partners to be able to do that. And you begin to erode those bonds. It's like termites working their way through the frame of a house. They begin to undermine it, and then perhaps that house isn't as stable for the future. And so looking at what's happening with the fracturing of the Euro-Atlantic community, those fractures are there. They have opened up. This doesn't mean that they're irreparable, that they can't be patched over. You can't go in and put in some sealant and try to put the structure back together again. But the cracks have opened up. They have weakened that tie of solidarity. Certainly in the case of Italy, that in those first critical weeks when it was Chinese and Russian efforts, even if they were modest, even if they were largely symbolic, but they had an impact. And then to turn around, later on and say, well, Italy, you must now do certain things vis-a-vis Russia because you're partners in Poland and Romania would like to see certain things happen vis-a-vis Russia and European solidarity, you may find that the Italians say, solidarity only goes so far, and we're going to do things that benefit us. The transatlantic relationship, even if there is a change of administration this November, the idea that you just magically pretend that these things haven't happened and you reset to an earlier stage, I don't think that happens either. So just to wrap up here, this is a case where the ethical question and the strategic question really merges together around this question of solidarity. As the ethical basis of solidarity has been damaged within the EuroAtlantic community, there will be strategic consequences. So with that, I think I've covered the first 15 minutes, and Joel, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Nick. That was perfect, right on time and right on topic. So thank you for that. So I wanted to pick up where you left off about how the strategic and the ethical come together. As I look at the pandemic, and I've been saying this to anybody who will listen, if ever there was a realist case for global cooperation, this would be it, right? You have a global scale challenge that affects everyone. So, what you've described is the reaction has been zero-sum thinking, right? Everybody's doubling down on zero-sum.
Zero-sum.
Right? Where it would seem that, again, from a realist perspective, from a practical perspective, from a problem-solving perspective, you would want some non-zero thinking, that it's just going to take a cooperative endeavor to make progress, for my people, if you will. So how do you respond to that? I mean, and how would we even think about trying to just change the frame or flip the switch or introduce that idea, particularly against the background of President of the United States right now is going just in the opposite direction, right? Any of these sort of non-zero solutions, whether it's international cooperation around an organization like WHO, right? He's just going the other way. So, any thoughts about that?
That's a great way to frame it. As you know, Amitai Etzioni, a good friend of the council for many years, America's leading communitarian or tribune of communitarianism, has talked about this for a number of years also in international politics from, a kind of backdoor realist question, right? Which is that countries, he's always been a little skeptical of the idea that countries work together because, out of a sense of the goodness of their hearts and, they believe in peace and brotherhood. And he's always maintained that this idea of, what is known as communitarian realism, that when countries are faced with a challenge that they, by their own resources, cannot adequately address, a realist consideration, that is a consideration with the survival of the state, survival of the country, maintenance of its position, will impel them to work together in order to fend the challenge off. And so that's different from a zero-sum approach, because one can argue that the zero-sum approach is what we saw as the response to the Great Depression after 1929, which is that countries said, well, I have to protect myself against this economic contagion, and took measures which made it worse for everyone. Everyone was hurt by them. And so, you could see an argument being made that international cooperation here, in this case of fighting the pandemic, is not a case of pie in the sky cosmopolitanism of, we have no countries and we're all one human family. But saying, no, this is making a Morgenthau-based power argument, which is that the ability of your state to come out of this pandemic reasonably intact, with hopefully most of your population recovering, and with your economic potential being retained, I think is the kind of way forward. We've already seen this, by the way, over the last month in the deal that has been brokered on energy.
Mhm.
that for a month we had a number of energy producers, Russia and Saudi Arabia in particular, deciding we're going to break with collective action because we want to maximize what we think are benefits for ourselves, right? If we increase our production of oil, then somehow we'll benefit and others will lose. And what everyone was discovering, even the United States, was that you were starting to have a race to the bottom,
Right.
where everyone was losing, and not cooperating. The zero sum mentality was not producing effects. I think one of the things that the current administration notwithstanding, I think you are going to see uh, the scientific and medical establishments in a number of countries saying, look, this pandemic threatens everyone. Uh, there is no group in the world has a natural immunity to it. No group in the world, no human group is somehow exempt from it, other than perhaps you know children and teenagers who seem to contract it but don't seem to develop symptoms largely. But that's not the idea that my country doesn't need to worry about it because somehow something in the genetic makeup of the majority of our population gives us an immunity. That's not the
Right.
case.
So
But we're
Nick,
also sorry,
yeah,
Joe, this other thing, what
yep,
we're also discovering, and this is where the fractured globalization comes in, is that we can fracture globalization, but nobody right now is prepared to go back to autarky,
right.
to say, look, we're going to pull up the drawbridges and keep the moat and pull up our drawbridges and just hunker down, because the costs of doing that are so astronomical. So this, I think, will compel this will force countries, even if they have to do so kicking and screaming, to some degree of cooperative action. Again, not out of a sense of this is the right thing to do in an ethical sense, but this is a strategic thing to do for the sake of maintaining power and prosperity.
Right. So it's a necessity argument. Just to follow that thread, one more step. So Gordon Brown has come out with a statement saying we need to sort of create some kind of new global coordinating mechanism to deal with the pandemic. My sense is that the model he has in mind was the response to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So the idea is, I guess, there's levels of sort of formality or informality, in terms of how the great powers, but also middle powers and others can kind of coordinate their response in some way. And so my sense is there are some models to look at. I suppose there's the financial crisis. There's also, to switch over to the health area, the Ebola crisis, right? There are different. And I guess my question to you is, are there some models we can look at to think about how to get to this sort of collective action problem and the sort of problem solving aspects of it?
Yeah, I think that we have to deal with certain political realities, which is that not just in the United States, but if you look at most of the major uh, great powers and middle powers right now have governments in place, whether it's China, India, Russia, the United States, Britain, uh, Italy, um, Saudi Arabia, place governments that instinctively are not interested in creating another formal level of
Right.
international organization. So I think those that are saying that we need a new, you know, broad-based multilateral organization with rules and a secretariat and structure, or who hope that this crisis will be, an opportunity to push for greater global integration. Politically, we're not there. I think then we have to look at the more ad hoc arrangements, um, through the G20, perhaps. Or what the U.S. set up in the early 2000s with the Proliferation Security Initiative, which is you have a set of principles, you create working groups, you have clusters of countries that come together to share capabilities and missions, but without creating that overarching bureaucratic structure. The same thing also, by the way, frankly, that we saw with the OPEC Plus
Mm-hmm.
arrangements, where there is no secretariat, there is no organization. I mean, OPEC is an organization, but then drawing in all of these other producers. I think it will have to be just politically. I think that's what the traffic will bear right now, is this more ad hoc arrangement. And of course, differing levels. I think where you have certain degrees of trust and relationships built up. And again, this is where the EuroAtlantic community has enormous, if untapped and somewhat damaged and frayed connections, but connections nonetheless, where, and we've already seen it with some of the early, companies and groups that are working on vaccines are these multinational, there's a lab in Canada that works with the lab in the US that has ties to Europeans and they're sharing data. Then they connect to someone in Israel with the biotech industry there. And so I think we'll also have to expect that there's going to be differing speeds. You're going to have an ad hoc response and there's going to be differing levels of integration and of cooperation within it. But then that does beg the question of leadership, which is that someone will have to coordinate. So,
Right.
What we saw with OPEC Plus is that, Russia and Saudi Arabia stepped up, to co-coordinate that. Then they had their falling out, and now they're maybe back to being coordinating again. But there was two clear energy ministers that, set the agenda. Right now, I think with this pandemic, we don't have a clear sense of, who the coordinators are. Is it
So
going to be the U.S.?
Right.
And of course, now that the Trump administration has decided to pick a fight with the World Health Organization, then that raises the question, well, if WHO was expected to play this coordinating role, then you already have one of the major stakeholders questioning whether or not it wants to support it.
So this brings me perfectly to the next question, going back to our theme of fracture in dissolving solidarity. Is China taking advantage of this moment? Is Russia taking advantage of this moment? My own view is that China is perhaps, and maybe will make a bid for leadership. I'm interested in your view on that.
Yeah.
Russia perhaps different. Russia maybe perhaps playing more of a spoiler, which is just the dissolving of the solidarity, just maybe, in their interests, right?
Yeah. Be interested, of course, to those who follow China much more closely than I do, to weigh in on this and then do that. But what I've seen is that obviously China does see an opportunity, as it has, as it made its bid in Davos in 2017. After the the inauguration of the Trump administration, to say, well, we can be the guarantor of international rules and so on and so forth. I think China is making a bid. It's undercut a bit by China's lack of transparency about certain aspects of how this crisis started. The luster of China's aid is diminished as Italians and Dutch and others discover that some of the things they've been receiving are defective or shoddy. But notwithstanding that, yes, China is making the case that in the absence of, or at least the diminished role of the United States, some major entity has to step forward. The European Union is still, I think, struggling. It's beginning to now to make some steps, in the right direction after a really problematic start in February and March. But whether Europe will also step forward to do it remains to be seen. But it really does raise this question. I mean, Ian Bremmer several years ago coined the G0 concept, right? What happens when you have a world order where there is no clear, you don't have a G20 that works, you don't have a G7 that works. The G2 or G3 concept of US and China or US, Europe and China doesn't take a role. What happens if you end up with G0? Right now we are living, I would say we're living in a G0 response, where Ian's thesis is being tested in real time with this. The Russians obviously, look, the Russians have always wanted not to eliminate American leadership in the world, because they don't seek to supplant it, but certainly they'd want to limit it. They'd want to cut it down to size. And they've been very effective both in the aid that they've provided and also in their information operations to really strike at this question of Euro-Atlantic solidarity, which is, to tell Europeans, different European states, why should you be damaging your relationship with Russia? Italy, Germany, Serbia, Hungary, why should you damage your relationship with Russia because other European countries want you to do it because they have a problem with Russia? What are you getting out of it? Where's the solidarity when in your time of need? So why should you do that in return? So I think you're seeing,
Right.
as you said, the spoiler aspect of Russia using this to, instead of facing a EuroAtlantic community of 800 million people with 20 plus trillion GDP, if they can begin to fracture that community so they can deal with pieces of it on a more equal basis, Putin channels his own internal Rahm Emanuel. Don't let a crisis go to waste, and he's definitely taking advantage of it for geopolitical consideration. It's a great piece that just came out by Eugene Rumer from the Carnegie Endowment, precisely on that point, that Putin is and the Russian leadership is looking for geostrategic advantage that they can extract from this crisis.
Great. I have one last question for my section of this, and then we'll turn it over to Alex for questions from the group. But I can't resist, and this is a big picture challenge to you, a bit of a provocation. So, sitting there in Newport as professor of national security strategy at the Naval War College, I'm thinking about your profession itself, and when I think about what the challenges are to national security now. We've gotten a lesson, and we could say that the biggest challenges may be, in some ways, sort of invisible, right? Cyber, AI, health issues that viruses, things like this, in climate, right? So, do you think that this one result from this crisis could be a rethinking of how we think about national security, away from sort of the harder usual ways of thinking about, warfare and capacities in that way, and thinking in a more innovative and creative way. But also, I'm going to be really ambitious with this question and tie it back to this question of solidarity, which is, the values and interests that will be coming together to address issues of cyber, AI, health, climate. Whether there's an opportunity to rethink and rebuild our way of thinking about national security around these values and interests of these new threats.
What I can tell you is that there's always been an ongoing debate about national security. What is it? What are the principal threats? My colleague here in Newport, Derek Revron, has been one of the thought leaders pushing this concept of human security, which is that you have to think of national security in terms of the security of the human beings under your care. And what the pandemic crisis, and again, going back to your earlier question about Russia taking advantage of it, one of the elements of the Russian information push has been to tell Europeans, are you really worried about Russian tanks and green men, or are you worried about viruses and disease? And people saying, a hypothetical clash over, a disputed piece of territory in East Europe is less relevant to me than, people dying, hospitals that are overstretched. So I think what you're seeing is, for the last several years, the U.S. national security community really gravitated to this idea of, great power competition, and we're back to traditional hard power, ship on ship, tank on tank, plane on plane clashes between great powers. And, we're really thinking about that. And the pandemic is pushing us, it's pushing both the national security community, but more importantly, it's pushing voters back to reconsidering what national security is. There's some great work that is being done as we speak, as people are looking at defense budgets and they're looking at people's responses to it, and people saying, what are we spending? I want more hospital ships. We need to have more, a more robust defense community that can respond to these types of outbreaks, not off, contesting with Russia and China over oil fields in eastern Syria, but, dropping in people that when we're hit by a virus, we have an immediate response. So I think you're going to see both in the national security community, and it'll be interesting to see if politicians in the US and in other countries begin to sound national security and defense spending that is more inward looking on this. This is something that, not to toot my own horn too much, but since I've been citing other people, but I did a report on this 2 weeks ago for the Foreign Policy Research Institute, looking at the impact of the pandemic on NATO. And one of the things we're already seeing is people saying, I want defense spending. I'm a part of an alliance, and defense spending is knowing that when there's a problem, there's rapid response and medical, the military has medical units that can be dropped in, and that's less about external projection of power and more about internal protection and internal security. So I think we're going to see this really pick up. It may not be that much of a front and center issue in our own presidential election this time around. It could pop up as a question, but I think this is going to be bubbling, particularly because as people say, look, this pandemic is not going to just simply be solved come summer. We may have more flare-ups. The Harvard study suggests that social distancing may be something we will have to continue doing in varying degrees, not necessarily lockdown, but varying degrees through 2022. That's going to cause people to question what they think of as national security and what they want their defense dollars spent. To the second question that you laid out, I think is something that we are really going to have to grapple with about interconnected networks, cyber, health, AI, dealing with climate change, and whether or not this is going to lead to a certain degree of retrenchment. That you're going to see, instead of us thinking about the world, we're going to see the United States and other countries begin thinking about more geographically contained areas where we say, look, we're going to concentrate on really resilient, smaller but more resilient networks within a smaller group of countries. Some of it may be dealing with climate change as well. Well, we need to ensure that, certain areas are protected. We want certain supply lines. We want, one of the things that may come out of this is the idea of the 10,000 mile long supply chain that may run through politically unstable, climate challenged, health challenged regions of the world. You may have companies saying, I'd like a supply chain that really only spans 3 or 4 countries and maybe spans a less geographic distance. So will this lead to countries beginning to think more in terms of pulling back and creating more compact and then creating networks within, and maybe not necessarily completely severing their ties or their linkages, but diminishing them? And we're already seeing this, by the way. We talk about the internet as a single global space, but the major authoritarian powers have already been creating alternative internets that they can then try to disconnect or lessen the connection to the larger internet. But at some point, will we have a Western network that, yes, it's connected to a larger global, but where we really make it dense and compact within? I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think it's going to be on the table. And it may align with the narrative as we've started to see in the 2016 and then in the 2020 campaign. We don't know the extent that Joe Biden will or will not embrace this, but certainly a number of his Democratic competitors for the nomination. We're talking about retrenching, pulling back, creating a more digestible international grouping of countries that wasn't every 194 countries of the world all coming together. So if we're going to see that kind of pressure in the years ahead, and whether or not this decoupling or partial decoupling with China becomes a bipartisan, a point of bipartisan agreement, which the Josh Rogin piece that we cited in Ethics and International Affairs last week, if that becomes a bipartisan point in the U.S., that we're going to decouple a bit with China, not disconnect, but decouple a bit, then that leads to your Joel, to your point that, more dense networks with a fewer set of countries and, parts of the world that we are less connected to.
Great answer. Thank you, Nick. I want to turn it over to Alex now. He's been collecting some questions from the audience. So Alex Woodson.
Sure. Hi. I don't see any questions on the chat just yet. Does anyone want to ask anything? I can ask one if no one's ready yet.
Yeah, my chat is showing nothing. So
Yeah. Okay. So I
yeah,
have a. Oh, here we go. It's from Billy Pickett. If Joe Biden becomes the nominee, can we return to a pre-2016 focus on international cooperation similar to that of the Obama administration? Will other nations still trust that the United States will be a reliable leader in global cooperation?
yeah. Another good friend of the Carnegie Council, Tom Nichols, has made the point that even if Biden wins or anyone else, successor administrations, his point is that once the United States demonstrated that it was willing or able to turn its back and to rupture some of these arrangements, it does become hard for other countries to ever fully retrust the United States again. So that even if Joe Biden wins the election and comes in and says, I want to reset to 2016, I'm sure other countries in Europe will be very welcoming of that, but they're going to be a bit more cautious because it's going to be a case of you did it once before. And it also shows that there is a segment of the American, both of the American electorate and then also of the American political elite that was willing to disconnect in that way. So I think you're always going to have from this point onward, European states in particular will want to recreate and reconnect, but they're going to hedge more the following. They're going to want to hedge their bets. The other thing, of course, which is a fascinating thing to speculate about is between now and November, how much does Joe Biden decide that he can reset or is prepared to do that? I mean, you had in President Obama's endorsement of his former vice president, essentially saying you can't completely reset, that you can't just go back to the policies that were of my administration, that things have changed. And so the question is what direction does Biden evolve in? Does he evolve in a more, does he take on some of the policy prescriptions and advice from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and then takes the Democratic establishment in that direction? And then, of course, one of the things that I always point out when I teach these things to students is, personnel is policy. Who will staff a Joe Biden administration? If you take that Thomas Friedman column that he wrote, where he sort of said, here we need a real kind of grand unity cabinet, and he had all these different proposals for people who should be serving in a Biden administration. You look at that and that becomes, well, some of it would be trying to reset, and then there'd be people saying, no, we want to take things in a different direction. And how hands-on of a president he plans to be if he's elected, who his vice president is, we don't know. How much does he follow the pattern of his own vice presidency and that of the Bush and Clinton administrations, with a much more involved and dynamic vice president who in some ways becomes not quite a co-president, but very much a junior figure in the administration. I mean, these are all things we don't know yet. I think that if Biden in his own heart of hearts would say, look, if I could magically reset the country back to where we were and the international system back to where we were in 2016, of course I would. Can I? I mean, that's the other question, which is, he may decide, just as Hillary Clinton did in 2016, that certain strategic initiatives that they both supported in the Obama administration, for political reasons, they will not support, just in the same way that Hillary Clinton, was for the Trans-Pacific Partnership until suddenly she discovered she was against it. When she discovered that a important chunk of the of her electorate was lukewarm about it. So I think that that's a great question. I think there's a lot in the air, and what we'll start to see over the next months is who the vice presidential pick is going to be. What happens at the convention in terms of, even if it's a virtual convention, who become the spokespeople, what become the themes, and then of course, what happened if Joe Biden is elected. What happens between November and January with, who controls the transition.
Okay, so we have another question from Brett Butchness. He writes, I agree that pushing against China is becoming a more bipartisan stance. However, I do question the economic viability of it. The exploding middle-class demographic in China represents a massive economic opportunity, and economic leaders in the US are keenly aware of this. For all of Trump's tough talk, to what extent is he willing to injure the economy on principle? For example, he has backed off of some tariffs and postured to back off of more. Are supply chains too deeply integrated to truly pull back without causing global recession?
Yeah, well, that's a great point, which is that politicians can talk, but economics walks, in the sense that what's the business community doing? What are companies doing? And this point about the embedded supply chains, I think, is a critical one, which is a lot of easy talk until consumers and producers begin looking at the costs of disconnecting those supply chains, disrupting them, and then trying to create new ones. Which is right now everyone is saying it's terrible to be connected to China. That doesn't mean that in a year's time, when we're through at least the first waves of the pandemic and people are back to work and back to spending, that they're going to say, I'm going to pay double for a television, or I'm going to pay 3 times the price for sneakers. But then I'll know that I'm doing my part to, disconnect our supply chains from China. And so I think that's the critical thing. And I think what my initial forays into, again, not scientific, not polling, but the people that I know that in the business community says that right now, no one is making any definitive reorientations of their supply chains. They are considering it, they're aware of it, but that no one has yet made the plunge to say, I am now prepared to disconnect from a supply chain in China, disconnect from the Chinese market, which the other point that Brett raised, and take my chances with a different supply chain. I think it'll be interesting for us to observe with this stimulus package that Prime Minister Abe got through the Diet in Japan, which has money for Japanese firms to try to repatriate certain things back to Japan, away from China. It'd be an interesting gamble to see what happens. In our context, Brett, I think one of the things we need to look at over the next year is what the Pentagon does in terms of supply chain management and stockpiling. Because if the Pentagon says, well, just-in-time supply chains and so on and so forth aren't working, and we're willing to put money back into this, and Congress is willing to appropriate that money. Just as a side note, Newport, the naval station at Newport, has a lot of empty warehouses now because we don't stockpile anymore. So there's, what used to be full depots of, of equipment and other things that were just sitting waiting for the balloon to go up. They're not really used anymore because we, have adapted to this global supply chain. And we might say just-in-time supply chains are a risk. So we might say, okay, not so just-in-time, but we're not going to radically reorient. So I think that's a good point. And it's easy for think tankers especially to talk about reorienting supply chains. The question is, are people who have to look at the bottom line, the green eye shade accountants looking at the bottom line of a company, so sanguine to do the same just because, a pundit opines that we should disconnect. So I think that again, and I think what we're going to see is people are going to look at what happens in Japan. If this Japanese effort is successful, you might see some effort to emulate it, but if it's not and it's just a boondoggle, and then once the crisis is over, it's back to supply chains as usual, then I think we'll have our answer.
I don't see any questions on the chat, so
I have one, Alex, unless you had something you wanted to add. Yeah. Nick, I've been trying to dwell on the more positive sides, but I do want to take a moment on the dark side here. So I'm curious as to how, going back to this idea, again, the main theme of fractured globalization and dissolving ethics. So one of the sort of leading areas, people that I look at to see, so where are we going with this thing, is what's happening in Hungary. with Viktor Orban, never waste a crisis. He's reacting in a certain way to consolidate his power. This is a country within NATO, really taking it, in my view, to the limit. We can have our own conversation about what's happening in our country and so on, but I'm just curious, this is sort of a taking the temperature question, what your level of concern is about, we have this wave of populists at various levels. This is a global trend. What are you seeing, and what's your level of concern about populist leaders who are taking advantage of this moment to consolidate power and dissolve our sort of that ethic a little bit further of solidarity that we might feel with?
Well, Joel, this connects back to your earlier comment about values, because NATO, the European Union as well, but NATO now has to deal with the reality that two of its members, Turkey and Hungary, are now considered to be, in the partially free or partially not free category, if you use that, the Freedom House characteristics, and that several other NATO members are teetering on, concerns about the viability of their democracies. So for NATO, this becomes a question of, is NATO a group of democracies, or is NATO reverting back to an earlier conception of, we are a group of countries that face a geopolitical, geostrategic threat from a large, perhaps unnamed country to the east, and we don't necessarily need to share values, we just need to know who we're against. But then that raises the solidarity question, because now in parts of Europe, you have people who would say, well, you may have a problem with Russia, we don't. And therefore, and if you don't share our values, we don't see a reason, therefore, to necessarily want to protect you. Take your chances. So, this erosion, NATO, after 1991, for 2 decades, NATO had a position where every country in NATO was adjudged to be a full democracy. And now we have a situation which reverts to a Cold War period in NATO, where NATO had non-democracies or had authoritarian or illiberal democracies, or whatever terms you want to use to say you're not really at the full liberal democratic level. You've had some backsliding on that. And what does that do to an alliance which then says, do we have common values as a basis of solidarity? The question too, which you've raised, which hopefully in more of these Carnegie discussions that we're going to do, because there are other people that are part of the Carnegie family who have really done some good work in thinking on this, is combining. Technology gives you tools now to monitor people in a pandemic, that when the pandemic is over, governments may not return those powers or those tools. That if you now have an app which essentially allows you, to say, so I've got my phone here, right? It can track, if I have it on and it's tracking me, and then someone enters data that says, you are symptomatic for the pandemic, and it sends out an alert saying, stay away from Nick as he's on the street, or that says, Nick has COVID-19, and this phone has detected that he is now out of his home property and he's in the store, so he needs to be detained as a public health menace. And you say, well, this is just for the nature of this emergency, but when the emergency is over, are these tools that governments are going to necessarily give up, or say, well, now that the emergency is over, we're going to return your privacy to you, and we're going to delete those apps, or we're not going to take the app which tracks you for your health status and then say, well, he's trying to, he's moving out, he has been, what we used to have in authoritarian states, in particular, when people would be not necessarily arrested, but confined to a certain area. You were not allowed to leave the city, you were not allowed to leave the village, and now you have the ability to say, well, you've left a zone. And well, first it was for pandemic health reasons, but now we think your ideas are just as dangerous as germs you may be carrying. And so we're going to use those same tools. I think that's something to be concerned about. The erosion of checks and balances. I know you said we're talking about Hungary, but even in this country, when you have, I'm going to take a very expansive definition of the Article 2 powers of the presidency to say that in a time of crisis, I can pretty much do anything. When you breach those guardrails in a democracy, it's hard to put the guardrails back up. This was, Senator Moynihan's classic observation back in his days as an academic, that, once you have claimed power for something, it's rare that that power goes back or is clawed back. So once you have, we saw that with, national security, with what people call security theater after 9/11, that we vastly increased, surveillance and other things in wake of 9/11. And then the pandemic has the opportunity to do the same. And then you have to trust, now we're moving, in the case of the Hungarians, because of the supermajority that Viktor Orban enjoys in the parliament right now, the check for Hungary is Viktor Orban himself. How does he choose to use these powers that he's been granted? And if he misuses them, what's the check against them, other than saying, well, the next election? But as we saw, and as we've seen even in countries that are formal democracies, that once you have those types of emergency powers, you can begin to find ways to get around checks and balances. So yeah, I think this is something that we need to be paying attention to, and maybe having one of the Carnegie friends of the Carnegie Council that really looks at the intersection of technology and politics to speak more on this, because this is not an issue that's going away.
So no, your powers of perception are uncanny. Our talk next week will be on health data, privacy, and surveillance.
Perfect.
You've set us up perfectly.
Then that's a good way to set us up for next week then.
We're going to work with Jeff Kahn from Johns Hopkins University, who's the director of the Center of Bioethics there, to lead us in this conversation. So this is almost seamless into our transition to next week. So thank you
Wonderful.
for that setup, by the way. So I want to thank you. We're coming to the end of the hour, so I'm going to adjourn the meeting. But Nick, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
This was great.
A great conversation to have.
You've given us a lot to pick up on as we move forward with these conversations. We'll try to do them weekly, or perhaps even more frequently. So I hope people will, be alert to the announcements for these programs. We're going to post the recordings on the Carnegie Council YouTube channel, and then you'll also
Wonderful.
see reference to them. And I believe transcripts will be available eventually on the Carnegie Council website. So thank you for kicking us off.
Thank you very much.
Great. So we'll be in touch, Nick, with you directly, but thanks to everybody who's been listening in, and we'll be in touch with you too to follow up.
Well, thanks to everyone, and see you next week then for the next talk.
Perfect. See you next week.
All right.
Thank you.